You think bumping into a billionaire is a fairy tale? It's not. When she spilled blood-red Cabernet across the chest of Chicago's most ruthless crime boss, she braced for a bullet. Instead, his hand locked around her throat, and he whispered the one name she had spent 7 years burying. In a room full of size 0 socialites and men who wore their power like loaded weapons, being fat was the best disguise she could have ever asked for. Her name was Chloe Hayes. At least that was the name printed on her W-2s, her tiny apartment lease in Humboldt Park, and the cheap plastic name tag pinned to her suffocating black uniform. As a banquet server at the Drake Hotel, she was part of the wallpaper. Rich, dangerous men didn't look twice at a woman who took up space. They liked sharp angles, hollow cheeks, and women they could break with one hand. Her softness, the thick curve of her thighs, chafing beneath cheap polyester, the full roundness of her face. It all rendered her completely invisible to the predators in the Gold Coast room. And she needed to be invisible. Survival depended on it. The gala was an exclusive charity auction, which in Chicago was simply code for a mob summit with an open bar. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, rare orchids, and impending violence. She balanced a silver tray loaded with 6 crystal goblets of 2015 Barolo, keeping her eyes glued to the intricate gold pattern on the carpet. "Just 3 more hours," she chanted in her head, feeling a bead of sweat roll down the curve of her spine. 3 more hours and you can take off these orthopedic shoes and pay your heating bill. She was navigating past a cluster of men laughing too loudly when it happened. She didn't see the polished black Oxford shoe step back into her path. Her heavy, rubber-soled shoe clipped the man's heel. Physics is a cruel mistress. With her momentum and the heavy weight of the tray, there was no regaining her balance. She pitched forward with a startled gasp. Time seemed to fracture into slow motion. She watched the 6 crystal goblets launch into the air like perfectly choreographed missiles. They didn't hit the floor. They hit Dominic Costello, the head of the Costello Syndicate. The Don who had reportedly ordered a hit on a rival boss during a Sunday mass. A man who was a ghost to the feds, but a god to the Chicago underworld. The heavy red wine splashed violently across the pristine, snowy expanse of his custom Tom Ford tuxedo shirt, staining the white silk like a fresh, gaping chest wound. The crystal shattered against the marble floor, the sound echoing like gunshots in a room that suddenly went dead silent. The jazz band abruptly stopped playing. She hit the floor hard, her knees taking the brunt of the impact, sending a shock wave of pain up her heavy thighs. The room was so quiet, she could hear her own ragged breathing. "Jesus Christ!" one of his bodyguards, a hulking man named Matteo, snarled, reaching inside his tailored jacket for a weapon that wasn't supposed to be past security. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. I am so sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling. She kept her head down, a pathetic, trembling heap of black polyester. "I lost my footing. I'm so sorry, sir." Dominic Costello didn't yell. He didn't signal for his men to drag her to the alley. He didn't even brush the dripping wine from his lapel. Instead, he slowly crouched down until he was at eye level with her. Her breath hitched as a large, calloused hand reached out. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for a strike. Instead, his fingers, smelling of expensive bergamot and gun oil, gently gripped her chin, forcing her face upward. She opened her eyes and met a gaze the color of shattered ice. Dominic Costello was terrifyingly handsome, with a sharp, aristocratic jawline and a brutal scar cutting through his left eyebrow. But it wasn't his looks that paralyzed her. It was the intense, microscopic way he was studying her face. He looked at her wide, panicked eyes, the fullness of her cheeks, the erratic pulse beating frantically at the base of her throat. I wasn't looking at Chloe, the fat waitress. He was looking through her. His thumb brushed over her lower lip, smudging away a speck of dust. The tenderness of the gesture was violently at odds with the deadly silence of the room. Then leaning in so close that his lips almost brushed the shell of her ear, he spoke. His voice was a dark, gravelly rumble, meant for her ears only. You put on weight to hide those cheekbones, but you could never change the shape of those eyes. Hello, Isabella. A bucket of ice water poured over her soul. The air vanished from her lungs. Isabella. Isabella Bianchi had died in a car fire outside of Palermo 7 years ago. She had seen the forged death certificate. Herself. She had burned her old passport, fled across the Atlantic, eaten until her body was unrecognizable to the men who wanted her dead, and buried the heiress to the Bianchi cartel under layers of fat, cheap clothes, and a Midwestern accent. I think you have the wrong person, sir, she squeaked, her voice pitching up in pure, unadulterated terror. My name is Chloe, Dominic smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow thing. Clean this up, Dominic ordered, not breaking eye contact with her, but speaking to his men. And bring the car around to the freight elevator. Miss Hayes is leaving with us. No. She tried to scramble backward, her heavy body fighting against the slick floor, but his hand shot out, his grip on her wrist like a steel vice. It didn't hurt, but it was an immovable, absolute force. Don't make a scene, Piccola, he whispered softly, his icy eyes flashing with a possessive darkness that made her blood run cold. Or I'll have Matteo shoot the manager who hired you. The choice is yours. The walk to the freight elevator was a blur of sheer panic. Dominic's hand rested on the small of her back, a seemingly polite gesture to any onlookers, but she could feel the cold, hard pressure of his knuckles pressing into her spine. Every time she hesitated, every time her heavy legs felt like lead, his grip tightened just enough to remind her that she was entirely at his mercy. She was shoved, gently, but with undeniable authority, into the back of a midnight black, armored Maybach S-Class idling in the alleyway. The leather seats squeaked beneath her weight as she slid as far away from him as the spacious cabin allowed, pressing herself into the tinted window. Dominic slid in beside her, his ruined, wine-soaked jacket discarded, leaving him in a tailored waistcoat and the blood-red stained shirt. The doors locked with a heavy, definitive thud. Drive, he told the driver, a shadow of a man sitting behind the bulletproof partition. The car glided forward, instantly swallowing the street noise of Chicago. The silence inside the cabin was suffocating. She wrapped her arms tightly around her stomach, deeply conscious of how much space she took up on the luxurious leather, how her frantic, shallow breathing was the only sound in the car. Where are you taking me? She finally choked out. Listen, Mr. Costello, I swear to God I don't know who this Isabella is. Stop! He didn't raise his voice, but the single word cut through the air like a blade. Dominic turned his head, resting his temple against his knuckles as he stared at her. Under the passing amber glow of the streetlights, his eyes missed nothing. He took in her double chin, the thick, unstyled mane of brown hair she had hastily pinned up. the soft, round slope of her shoulders. Most men looked at her body with either dismissal or disgust. Dominic looked at her like a starving man, staring at a feast he had been denied for a decade. Arturo Bianchi, Dominic said slowly, letting the name of her murdered father hang in the air. He was a cautious man, paranoiac even. When the rival families cornered him in Sicily, they found his car at the bottom of a ravine. 2 bodies inside, burned beyond dental recognition. The Italian authorities closed the case. The American syndicates drank to his demise. She swallowed hard, tasting bile. I don't know what you're talking about. Dominic reached into the inner pocket of his discarded jacket on the seat between them. He pulled out a sleek tablet, tapped the screen a few times, and tossed it onto her lap. She looked down. It was a digital dossier. Subject: Chloe Hayes, SSN, issued in 2019, flagged as a ghost identity. Address: 22410, N, California Ave, Apt 3B. Medical records: polycystic ovary syndrome diagnosis in 2021. Rapid weight gain documented. Employment: the Drake Hotel. Hired via Apex Staffing, a shell company owned by the Costello Syndicate. Her breath hitched. She looked up at him, betrayal and terror warring in her chest. You hired me. I've been tracking a ghost for 3 years, Isabella, Dominic said, leaning closer. The smell of the spilled Barolo wine on his chest was intoxicating and metallic. When the facial recognition software flagged a 32% match on a woman in Chicago, my men told me to ignore it. They said, "Look at her, boss. The Bianchi girl was a runway model. This woman is easily 200 pounds. It's not her." Tears pricked the corners of her eyes. The brutal, clinical way he discussed her body stung, ripping open insecurities she'd tried to keep buried. She had built this flesh fortress to protect herself, to become unappealing, to become safe. "So why didn't you listen to them?" she whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down her plump cheek. Dominic shifted closer, closing the distance between them until his knee brushed against her heavy thigh. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "Because I remember the night of the Palermo summit, before the fire," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its coldness and taking on a raw, ragged edge. "I remember a 19-year-old girl hiding in the library, terrified of the monsters in the ballroom. I remember giving her my handkerchief because she was crying over a bird with a broken wing." Her heart stopped. The boy in the library. The older teenager, with the piercing eyes, who had promised not to tell her father she was crying. "Dominic?" she breathed, the name slipping out before she could stop it. The ultimate confession. She had just confirmed everything. His eyes flared with a dark, triumphant fire. He reached out, and this time she didn't flinch away as his large palm cupped her cheek. His thumb wiped away the tear, just as he had wiped the dust from her lip earlier. "They thought you were dead. They thought the bloodline ended," Dominic murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. "But I knew. You masked your jawline. You hid your figure. You changed your voice. But I would recognize your soul in a completely different body, Isabella. Why did you bring me here?" she cried softly, leaning into his touch, despite every survival instinct screaming at her to run. "If they know I'm alive, the Rossi family will come to Chicago. They'll kill me. You're putting a target on your own back by having me in this car." "Let them come," Dominic said, a lethal, bloodthirsty smirk playing on his lips. "The Rossi family thinks they own the East Coast shipping lanes. because the Bianchi heir is dead. Tomorrow morning, I am going to parade you into the Syndicate Council." She shook her head frantically. "No, I'm fat, I'm poor, I'm nobody. They won't accept me as the heir. I don't look the part anymore." Dominic's grip on her face tightened, turning slightly bruising, demanding her absolute attention. The amusement vanished from his face, replaced by a fierce, terrifying devotion. "You are Isabella Bianchi. It doesn't matter if you weigh 100 pounds or 300 pounds. You carry the blood of kings in your veins, and by the time this week is over, you are going to wear my ring on your finger. You're going to take back your empire, and you're going to do it at my side." I wasn't going to kill her. He was going to marry her. And in the Mafia, that was often a fate far worse than a bullet. The Costello estate was a sprawling, Gothic limestone fortress, hidden behind 12-foot wrought iron gates on Sheridan Road in Lake Forest, Illinois. It was the kind of wealth that didn't just whisper, it threatened. As Dominic led her through the cavernous foyer, her cheap, wine-stained uniform felt like a neon sign broadcasting her unworthiness. The house staff, immaculately dressed, silent and efficient, averted their eyes. She was led up a sweeping mahogany staircase to a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment building in Humboldt Park. "Wash up," Dominic instructed, leaning against the doorframe. He looked at her disheveled hair, her flushed, round cheeks, and the heavy slump of her shoulders. "There are clothes in the closet. My sister's measurements are similar to yours. Tomorrow at noon, the commission meets in the grand dining room. You will be seated at my right hand." "They won't believe it's me," she said, her voice barely a rasp. She wrapped her arms around her thick waist, trying to make herself smaller, though it was an impossible task. "Dominic, look at me." The Bianchi heir was a slender, delicate little thing who played the cello and wore Chanel. "I am a size 22 waitress who smells like garlic and floor wax. They will laugh you out of the room. They'll think you brought in a fraud to steal my father's remaining offshore accounts at UBS." Dominic pushed off the doorframe, closing the distance between them with the predatory grace of a snow leopard. He didn't stop until his chest brushed against her. He reached down, his large hands gripping her wide hips, pulling her soft belly flush against his hard, muscular frame. "Let them laugh," he murmured, his breath hot against her temple. "The last man who laughed at me is currently buried under the foundation of the new stadium in the South Loop. You survived, Isabella. Your body did exactly what it needed to do to keep you alive when the rest of your family burned. I don't see a waitress. I see a survivor. I see a queen. And tomorrow, so will they." The next afternoon, the air in the grand dining room was suffocatingly tense. 10 men sat around a massive, custom-built walnut table. These were the capos, the underbosses, the financial architects who laundered millions through shell corporations in the Cayman Islands and real estate firms in downtown Chicago. She stood at the threshold, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wore a custom emerald green wrap dress. Dominic had procured overnight from a private tailor. It hugged her heavy curves, cinching at her waist and draping elegantly over her thick thighs. Her hair, washed and styled, cascaded in dark waves over her shoulders. She still felt immense, vulnerable, and completely out of place among these sharp-suited wolves. Dominic stood at the head of the table. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, "allow me to introduce my future wife, Isabella Bianchi." A deafening silence fell over the room. Carmine, an ancient, scarred capo who had controlled the Southside docks for 40 years, adjusted his glasses. He looked her up and down, his lip curling in unmistakable disgust. He leaned over to the man next to him, Arthur, and muttered in rapid, guttural Sicilian dialect. Guardala, è una vacca. Dominic sta perdendo la testa se pensa che questa contadina grassa sia sangue dei bianchi. Look at her. She's a cow. Dominic is losing his mind if he thinks this fat peasant is Bianchi blood. They assumed she was just some Midwestern girl Dominic had pulled off the street. They assumed the language of her ancestors was dead to her. She didn't wait for Dominic to defend her. 7 years of hiding, of being stepped on, ignored, and treated like a piece of ugly furniture suddenly boiled over into a white-hot rage. She stepped into the room, the heels of her pumps clicking sharply against the hardwood. She walked directly up to Carmine, her heavy frame casting a long shadow over his chair. She planted her hands firmly on the table, leaning her weight forward, forcing him to look up at her. My father, Arturo Bianchi, once broke a man's jaw with a brass paperweight for speaking out of turn at this very table in 2012, she said, her voice dropping into the exact, flawless Sicilian dialect Carmine had just used. Se mi chiami di nuovo vacca, Carmine, ti taglierò la lingua e la darò in pasto ai cani randagi di Palermo. Mi sono spiegata? If you call me a cow again, Carmine, I will cut out your tongue and feed it to the stray dogs of Palermo. Make myself clear. The color drained entirely from Carmine's weathered face. The room erupted into frantic whispers. The posture, the flawless dialect, the specific, terrifying reference to her father's 2012 temper. It was undeniable. Dominic didn't say a word, but the feral, fiercely proud smile on his face was blinding. He pulled out the heavy oak chair to his right. Sit, Mia Regina, he commanded softly. She sat. The men around the table adjusted their ties, suddenly refusing to meet her eye. She had just claimed her throne, but not everyone was ready to bow. 3 days before the wedding, the illusion of safety shattered. Dominic was downtown, securing the Port Authority bribes for the month. She was alone in the estate's massive industrial kitchen, craving the simple comfort of a grilled cheese sandwich. The mansion was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. She was at the stove, watching the butter melt in a heavy cast-iron skillet, when the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. You really shouldn't be eating that, Miss Bianchi. She spun around. Matteo, the hulking bodyguard who had been with Dominic at the charity gala, stood in the doorway. But he wasn't standing guard. In his right hand, equipped with a heavy silencer, was a 9mm Glock. Matteo, she breathed, dropping the spatula. What are you doing? The Rossi family sends their regards, he sneered, stepping fully into the kitchen and locking the heavy oak door behind him. They're offering $5 million to make sure the Bianchi bloodline actually ends this time. I figured I'd do them a favor. Dominic is blind, letting a fat, weak liability like you drag this syndicate into a war. Panic seized her chest, tight and agonizing. She was trapped. Matteo was 6'4", built like a brick wall and heavily armed. She was a 240-pound woman in bare feet and a silk robe. Dominic will flay you alive, she warned, backing away slowly until her lower back hit the marble island. Dominic won't know it was me. It'll look like a Rossi hit squad breached the perimeter, Matteo said, raising the weapon and aiming it directly at her chest. Say hi to your father in hell, piggy. He underestimated her. Everyone always did. They looked at her size and saw slowness. They saw a target. They didn't see the mass, the leverage, or the desperate, feral will to live that had kept her breathing for 7 years. As Matteo's finger tightened on the trigger, she didn't scream. She grabbed the handle of the cast iron skillet, still slick with sizzling, popping butter. With a guttural roar, she hurled the boiling grease and the heavy iron pan directly at his face. Matteo shrieked as the scalding oil caught him across the eyes. The gun went off with a muffled thwip, the bullet burying itself harmlessly into the plaster ceiling. He dropped his weapon, bringing his hands up to his blistered face, stumbling backward blindly. She didn't run away. She ran at him, using every ounce of her weight, every pound she had cursed in the mirror for years. She launched her entire body into his chest like a linebacker. The impact was devastating. Matteo, off balance and blinded, crashed backward into the heavy stainless steel refrigerator. The breath exploded from his lungs in a sickening wheeze. As he slumped toward the floor, she kicked the discarded Glock across the linoleum, out of his reach. She stood over him, her chest heaving, her silk robe stained with butter, as he writhed on the floor, clawing at his burned face. The kitchen door was suddenly kicked off its hinges. Dominic burst into the room, an assault rifle raised, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. An emotion she never thought the ruthless Don of Chicago was capable of feeling. 3 other guards flooded in behind him. Dominic's wild eyes snapped from the bullet hole in the ceiling to the groaning, blistered Matteo on the floor, and finally to her, standing victorious with her fists clenched. The terror melted from Dominic's face, replaced by a dark, awe-struck worship. He lowered his weapon and walked slowly toward her, completely ignoring the bleeding traitor at her feet. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice shaking with adrenaline. "I'm fine," she breathed, her knees finally beginning to tremble. "He's a mole for the Rossi family. He tried to kill me." Dominic didn't look at Matteo. He just snapped his fingers. His men dragged the screaming bodyguard out of the kitchen by his heels. She didn't ask what would happen to him, and Dominic didn't offer. Instead, he took her trembling, butter-stained hands in his, pressing a fervent kiss to her knuckles. "My beautiful, vicious queen," he whispered reverently. "I'm going to burn the Rossi family to ash for even thinking they could touch you." 2 weeks later, the bells of Holy Name Cathedral rang out across downtown Chicago. The city's elite, politicians, and underworld bosses packed the pews, suffocating the air with the scent of lilies and expensive cologne. The Rossi family was noticeably absent. Their top 3 lieutenants had been found at the bottom of the Chicago River 3 days prior, a brutal wedding gift from the groom. She stood in the vestibule, looking at her reflection in the full-length mirror. She was not wearing a corset. She was not trying to hide her body. Her wedding gown, custom designed by Christian Siriano, was a masterpiece of ivory Mikado silk. It featured a deep sweetheart neckline that showcased her full chest, and a dramatic, sweeping ball gown skirt that cascaded over her wide hips. The delicate chantilly lace sleeves hugged her thick arms. She looked immense. She looked powerful. She looked like a Bianchi. The heavy mahogany doors swung open, and the organ music swelled. She didn't have a father to walk her down the aisle, so she walked alone. She kept her head high, her shoulders back, daring anyone in the pews to look at her with anything less than absolute respect. At the end of the aisle stood Dominic. He wore a razor-sharp charcoal Tom Ford tuxedo, But all the danger, all the lethal edge he carried, vanished when his eyes locked onto hers. He looked at her like she was the only breathing thing in a room full of ghosts. As she reached the altar, he took her hands. His thumb brushed over the heavy, diamond-encrusted Bianchi family crest ring she now wore on her index finger. "You are exactly as you were meant to be," Dominic whispered, the vow for her ears only as the priest began the Latin liturgy. "Mine." She squeezed his hands, feeling the solid, terrifying reality of the life she had just reclaimed. She had spent 7 years hiding her name, shrinking her spirit, and apologizing for the space her body took up. Never again. She was Isabella Bianchi Costello, and she was going to rule Chicago. Do you crave more intense, heart-stopping, mafia romance and underdog revenge stories? Hit that like button, share this video with a friend who loves a ruthless billionaire, and subscribe to the channel. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Drop a comment below. What would you do if you accidentally spilled wine on a mob boss? Let's talk about it.